back to Theology with Mr. L. I'm Mr. L, Jason Liuzzi. Nice to see you guys again. Today in this video we're continuing talking about the sacrament of holy orders. So in our previous video we talked about the institution of the sacrament, which took place at the Last Supper. And now we're moving on and kind of moving forward and talking a little bit about the history of the sacrament, kind of how we see it throughout time a little bit. And I'm going to leave you guys with the cliffhanger, which will be a good time. Spoilers. All right, so as I said, to kind of start off, this sacrament was instituted, created, established, and distributed, given to the apostles at the Last Supper. Now, what that term apostle, it's really important because I feel like a question I get all the time is what's the difference between an apostle and a disciple? And it's simply this: the apostles are just a specific group of disciples. So when Christ gave this power, this sacrament to his apostles, it was very specific and very intentional. So his apostles were this group of men that he selected himself, right? That Christ himself chose these men to come and follow him. As opposed to maybe some of these other people who kind of left it up to them. They had to make this choice. He didn't necessarily directly invite them, call them to his side to follow him. That's who the 12 apostles were. They were these specific men chosen to follow Christ, right? So at the Last Supper, he gives this power and this authority to the apostles. Basically, he makes them, or he doesn't make them, I don't want to say priests, because we'll get into that in a second, but he gives them the sacrament of holy orders. All right. Now, this term, apostle, as I said, exclusively just applied to those 12 men, all right, who Christ gave the sacrament of holy orders to, and that followed him for those 3 years that he was doing his public ministry. Now, what's interesting is what we see is after Christ's ascension, so that's right when Christ goes into heaven, right? He takes himself into heaven. What we see is after that this term starts being used and applied to other people as well. Namely, like Matthias. So who's Matthias? We see Matthias in the first chapters of Acts. And Matthias is the person chosen to replace Judas. Right? He just betrayed Jesus. And was no longer with them, right? And so Matthias is chosen to replace Judas, and he's considered an apostle. So that's important. And then later on with St. Paul, we see that St. Paul is often referred to as an apostle. So it gets really interesting because this term apostle goes from being very specific as referring to only these 12 men to being a term that's used kind of, I don't want to say, how would I say it? I would just say that it's used kind of to talk about other people, and it seems as though this term has to do with more of a role rather than kind of anything else. So we have to see that this term applies to really it's these men of authority within the church, and that's really kind of what we first see. We see that throughout even Scripture, we see that the term apostle kind of being used with regards to St. Paul, with regards to Matthias, with regards to Barnabas, who's a guy that was with Paul. And so it's this term that seems to carry a lot of weight and authority with it. And so what's really important is that what we see kind of in our minds, what we should think about is the apostles. That term is synonymous or a synonym kind of for, at this time, right after the resurrection and the ascension and all that, it's basically synonymous with the term bishop. Right? So if someone is an apostle, they're considered kind of a bishop. Now, they wouldn't necessarily have had that title, but that's how we can kind of view these people. So the apostles, right, the 12 apostles were the first bishops. They weren't necessarily the first priests, which is why at the beginning of the video I didn't want to say that Christ made them priests, because he made them more than that, right? That he made them bishops. Now, in later videos, we'll talk about the three kind of levels of the sacrament. That within this sacrament, that there are 3 levels that you can receive. But being a bishop is the top kind of level. It's the fullness of the sacrament. So When Christ gave this sacrament to the apostles, and then later to people like, well, Paul also received this sacrament through Christ, right? Because if we know the story of Paul, Christ himself literally comes to Paul on his way to Damascus, and it's this radical moment for Paul. But we see that these men have all received the sacrament from Christ, basically, that they've had this encounter with Christ physically after the resurrection. And that they have this encounter, and that they've also at least known Christ and been with him for a period of time, the exception of Paul, but we can get into Paul a little bit later. Now, we see that term apostles applied to these people, but then we also begin to see some other really interesting things happen as well. We see that there are bishops kind of set up in different kind of areas, and we understand that the bishop is the person with kind of greatest authority over a specific geographical area. So the bishops are kind of like the top guy in charge, and then they might have some people underneath them and that kind of a thing at this time. Now we also see that there are two other bishops that we know of for sure in Scripture that we hear about, and those are Timothy and Titus. And they were in Ephesus and Crete, right? So they were the guys in charge of these two places, right? And like I said, we begin to see a lot of really cool things happening. Namely, we see that Christ has given this power to the apostles to kind of, he's given them this sacrament, and then they start kind of passing it on to other people. Now, how they do that and how that looks, it's not necessarily clear in Scripture. We do see that they lay hands on people, and there's that kind of aspect of it as well. But we can get into that a little bit more kind of in some later videos. But it wasn't until 100 AD, so relatively speaking, shortly after the time of Christ, but it's still a good bit of time, that's when we first actually hear like really kind of specific language used with regards to holy orders. Right up to this point, it was just kind of like leaders and elders and that kind of stuff, those types of terms that we kind of hear about. But there's this, it's not until 100 AD that we specifically hear the term bishop, priest, deacon, right, which are the terms that we would understand and use today. And so that's kind of a really important thing, because we do see from the early church that this is taking place, and we see even kind of removed just a little bit from that early church that this is something that is very clear and kind of specifically laid out. Now, as I said, there are three levels of authority, the bishop being the highest, then a priest, and then a deacon. We'll get into that in a later video. But what we're beginning to kind of introduce here is actually this concept of apostolic succession. And apostolic succession is just the term that we use, the principle that we understand is kind of how Christ gave all of this power and authority to his apostles. How does that go from 33 AD, that power and authority, to today? Right? How do we get from here to here, right? Because that's really vitally important to literally everything that we know and believe, right? So we get that Christ gave this power to the apostles, but then how then do our priests and deacons and bishops today have the ability to do and say what they can and do? And so that's where we're going to actually leave today off. I know, just leaving you hanging here, but the next video we are going to specifically talk about apostolic succession. We're going to look into this a little bit more, a little bit of how the sacrament kind of evolves over time. But the big thing that you need to take away from this today is that Christ made his apostles the first bishops, right? And that those bishops then went out and they kind of founded what we would say these little churches. Now, that's not to say that as Catholics we would understand that all of these are the same church, capital C church, right? Church, but they kind of are established in these different little areas and regions and that kind of stuff, but all united together, right, as one Catholic church. Now, what we see then is, well, they can only be in so many places at so many times, so then they give this power and authority that Christ gave to them to other people as well. And we see that even in Scripture with people like Timothy and Titus. All right, so we'll leave it from there. We'll kind of see what happens here in a little bit. Next video, we're going to talk about apostolic succession, so be prepared for that. Have a good one. This has been Theology with Mr. L. I'm Mr. L. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any questions, put them down below. See you guys.